guys. So anyone who's watched my channel for any length of time knows that I'm not breaking news or up to the minute on current events. Sometimes I'm a little late to the party. But apparently there's been a significant development in the UK that happened in the House of Commons on June 17th, where an elected official of the British Parliament called out the Jehovah's Witnesses organization for their, quote, atrocious mishandling of CSA cases, and also how Jehovah's Witnesses shunning practice, mandated shunning practice, reinforces a culture of silence and, basically turning a blind eye to this abuse. So this man is Sam Carling, and he is quickly becoming a hero in XJW circles for basically his direct, no BS approach in the place where it matters most, government. We have to hit Watchtower where it hurts. And sometimes it really feels insurmountable. But here Sam Carling has sent this jolt of hope, basically, through the XJW community and for victims of CSA. That maybe there'll be finally some forward momentum in regards to protecting Jehovah's Witness children, children in the Jehovah's Witnesses and other religious organizations. So anyways, just in case you don't know what I'm referring to, I'm gonna play the clip here and then share 3 key points that I gleaned from Sam Carling's June 17th address.
Sam Carling.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And may I begin by again welcoming this bill. It will deliver so much for my constituents in relation to protecting people from crime and enabling tough action on antisocial behaviour, including areas which have for too long been labelled low level and ignored, like the illegal and off-road bikes, which my constituents so often raise with me. And it will introduce mandatory reporting for child sexual abuse, one of the key recommendations from the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which I'll abbreviate as ICSA for the remainder of this speech. That is a long overdue measure and one long called for by our Labour Home Secretary and the Prime Minister personally. However, I remain concerned that the government is not going far enough on the issue of mandatory reporting, and that is why I have laid 3 amendments to the bill on that subject, numbered 10, 11 and 22, which my speech today will focus on. These are not intended to change government policy, quite the opposite. These amendments are intended to deliver the government's stated policy, to implement the ICSA recommendations relevant to the Home Office in full. The Home Secretary stated in January that this was the government's intention. And she reaffirmed that just yesterday, actually, in response to my question on her statement, with a firm yes, after I asked if it remained her policy to implement them in full. But there are 3 significant gaps in our plans to implement Recommendation 13 on mandatory reporting, where the bill is not delivering what ICSA recommended. With these gaps, I am concerned that the duty to report will be ineffective in some of the settings where it is most needed, religious groups in particular. And I will use the example of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the religious group which I grew up in, to illustrate how and why. They have a deep cultural distrust of secular authorities, and that leads to a culture of dealing with everything internally, as happens in a lot of different religious groups, including child sexual abuse, and reporting nothing to the police. Furthermore, their internal processes for doing so are atrocious. For example, there's something called the 2-witness rule, which means they take no action on any report of wrongdoing unless there are 2 witnesses to it. There are never 2 witnesses to child sexual abuse. I give this context to highlight why the mandatory duty to report must be absolutely watertight, as ICSA recommended, to prevent people in leadership organisations, or in leadership of organisations like this, from avoiding it. So I'll come to the 3 gaps in turn. Firstly, there are no criminal sanctions if you don't comply with the duty. I understand that the government is proposing professional sanctions, i.e. a referral to the Disclosure and Barring Service and to relevant professional regulators, but that's not actually on the face of the bill, and it would only apply to a fraction of people under the duty. It would not, for example, do much in religious settings, where so many of the failings are happening and where the duty would, if constructed properly, immensely help to protect children. ICSA were clear that failure to comply should be a criminal offence. My Amendment 10 makes this the case and proposes a fine as the appropriate sanction, which is in line with best practice overseas. Because many other countries, France, Australia, parts of Canada and so on, have introduced mandatory reporting, and many have done so with criminal sanctions of this kind. And while the government will likely say that criminal sanctions could have a chilling effect that stops people going into professions that work with children, The international evidence clearly shows that this does not happen. In the Australian state of Victoria, for example, and Professor Ben Matthews has done some extensive research on mandatory reporting laws and their efficacy, which I thoroughly encourage the Minister to ask officials to examine. The second gap relates to who actually comes under the duty to report. ICSA recommended that it should apply to anyone working, firstly, in regulated activities with children under the Safeguarding and Vulnerable Groups Act 2006. The bill uses that criterion, tick. But ICSA then also recommends that it should apply to anyone in a position of trust over a child as defined by the Sexual Offences Act 2003. And that's what the bill does not include. My Amendment 22 would make it so. At the moment, the bill instead creates a list of relevant activities in Part 2 of Schedule 8, which replicates about 90% of what is in the Sexual Offences Act. But that missing 10% is critical. It includes sports coaches and teachers, for a start, which our schedule does not. And to go back to my example, the Sexual Offences Act includes a very effective definition of religious leaders in section 22A. We have put a definition of religious leaders into our schedule in this bill, but it requires them to have, and I quote, regular unsupervised contact with children to be subject to the duty. That will allow virtually any religious leader, be they paid clergy or a volunteer elder, like in the Jehovah's Witnesses, to escape the duty, as very few have regular unsupervised contact with children, despite being in a very significant position of power and influence. And I personally happen to know at least one person who actually was sexually abused as a child in that organisation. They went to speak to religious elders about it in the presence of their parents, and not unsupervised, and they were advised that to go to the police would mean bringing reproach on God's name. So no report was made, either by the victim, their family, or those religious elders. This is commonplace. And under the bill as currently drafted, there's no sanction for that. The elders aren't mandated reporters, and even if they were, the proposed offence under clause 73 around stopping someone else from making a report, which I very much welcome for the record, only applies to other mandated reporters. So if someone pressures a victim, or their parents for example, not to make a report, that won't be illegal. So that offence needs to be broadened too, and I know the NSPCC are calling for the government to consider a broader offence of concealing child sexual abuse, which I urge the government to give serious consideration to, and I may give some more detail on that later if there's time.
Will you give way?
I will give way.
Cameron Thomas.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way. He's making very important points about, particularly about the Jehovah's Witness cult. And one of the methods that they use to ensure that issues like this don't escape from the organisation itself is the act of disfellowship, where an individual is threatened by being disfellowshipped all communication with their own family. And I wonder if he'll go a little further into recognising that too. Thank you.
Sam Carling.
I absolutely will, and I very much thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. I'm very pleased that other Honourable Members in the House are aware of that issue. It's something I am trying to do some work on separately. I think it is certainly relevant to what I'm discussing here. Just to give the House a little more context on that, what that essentially means is if that organisation decides that someone has committed a serious sin, it can essentially tell all of their family and friends to cut them off permanently. The same applies if they just choose to leave the religion. But very rarely is that applied to perpetrators of crimes, and more often to victims that report them. And it is an enormous problem that has to be dealt with, and I look forward to engaging with the Honourable Member further on that.
Okay, so that was Sam Carling arguing for changes to the crime and policing bill. And you have Parliament member Cameron Thomas later on piping up in the latter half. We're going to circle back around to him. And of course you can go back and review all this footage yourself and get into all the details and the legalese. But again, there are three key reasons why this exchange was so significant. Sam Carling is a former Jehovah's Witness. So number one, Sam Carling is a former Jehovah's Witness. This alone lends massive credibility to his statements because he has personal experience. He was once a witness. He had an insider view. He even said he knew someone who was a CSA victim in the congregation. It's like I've said with therapy. It's one thing to study certain disorders and I guess in this case like religious abuse or religious trauma and have a textbook understanding and then you treat people from there. Okay. But like, let's say you're a former Jehovah's Witness yourself and you're a therapist, you're in a way better position to help a witness because you know the psyche of a witness. You have that lived experience. So yeah, it's not only amazing that this was brought up in the House of Commons, and I'm not going to pretend to know a ton about British government, but Sam Carling was once a Jehovah's Witness, and can attest to the gross mishandling, or as he puts it, atrocious mishandling of CSA cases in Jehovah's Witnesses congregations worldwide. Exposes JW loopholes. So Carling basically says, look, Jehovah's Witnesses policies are horrific and woefully negligent thanks to the two-witness rule, which requires that a CSA victim substantiate their claims and prove that they were abused by producing two witnesses, if they come forward at all. He's basically like, look, this is stupid. He said in his address, there's never two witnesses to this type of abuse. Anybody in a position of authority in the congregation who has an ounce of integrity or brain power would understand that. He's like, there's not going to be two pairs of eyes at this type of crime scene. How stupid are you? Not just stupid, but obviously extremely dangerous. But I love that he said the organization has a deep cultural mistrust of secular authorities, and therefore they try to deal with the CSA cases in-house. Again, if I had even an ounce of power, or was in a position of authority, that would scream red flags to me. Basically saying that, yeah, there's mandatory reporting laws for adults who are in regular unsupervised contact with children, but that's a really thin argument to apply to, as he calls them, volunteer elders in the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's a really thin argument that allows elders to get a free pass. It's like basically, even though, they don't teach Sunday school or, daycare, or they're not camp counselors going on church camping trips where brother pervert can, stay in close quarters with a group of small children all weekend. Even though that's technically not the case, there are still so many opportunities for elders to abuse children within the congregation and still fly under the radar. So, the whole point is that it may not be a big bullet point on their job description. Job duties. I regularly spend time with children unattended or unsupervised under the age of 12. May not be in their official job description. Carling is basically saying, that doesn't mean that this hasn't happened. It doesn't mean there's no risk. There's even a bigger risk. We need to be looking at that because there is that trust and authority that's fostered in the Jehovah's Witnesses that is taken advantage of. He's basically saying, yeah, it's really important that we get primary teachers and soccer coaches on this list to be, mandatory reporters. But hello, Jehovah's Witnesses, we need to be talking about that. There is a massive loophole when it comes to religious leaders. I have personal experience and can attest to this. And they too, the Jehovah's Witness elders, should be subject to mandatory reporting laws and criminal investigation if needed. And he also mentioned in so many words that there's no punishment for elders if they pressure CSA victims and their families into silence, because you don't want to bring reproach on Jehovah's name. You don't want to make the organization look bad, so don't go to the police. And again, he mentioned his friend, that's what happened to his friend, and that it's commonplace. He used the word commonplace. So, not only does the POS perpetrator get a pass from the elders, it was probably an elder who did it. They also have the power to intimidate and coerce victims into silence because it's bad PR for the organization. Absolutely vile. The role of the shunning policy. All right, this part gave me chills because you have Cameron Thomas, who's basically for the opposing side, the opposing party. Again, somebody might need to correct me on that. Please clarify that for me because I don't know the ins and outs of UK government. He stands up out of nowhere and he's like, oh yeah, I agree with him actually. One, what does it say about Jehovah's Witnesses as an institution that you have someone on the opposing team going, oh yeah, no, everything he's saying is totally true. I can fully attest to the scope and damage of this organization. That's how widespread it is. I agree with him. We should be talking about this. Oh yeah, and then, have you heard about the shunning policy and how it reinforces a culture of silencing victims? Yeah, they do that too. So the perpetrator is set loose and can go on to abuse other kids. No one can talk to the family or the victim. They're basically just treated like shit. And oh yeah, another thing, they're a cult. Love it. Love it, love it, love it that this man explicitly called the Jehovah's Witnesses a cult. Why is this big? Because government largely doesn't want to touch religious freedom. In their eyes, that's a bold, at least in the US, it's a bold statement to make that's neither here nor there. I mean, again, for the US, but across the board, governments generally speaking are painfully ignorant and reticent to explore concepts like undue influence, coercive control. But what constitutes a cult? Am I right? What constitutes a cult or just a set of religious beliefs? Yeah, potato patata. But damn, Cameron Thomas stands up and is like, oh no, they're a cult, and let me tell you why. This is not a quirky, harmless group that peddles pamphlets and has the freedom to peddle their pamphlets. They are actively harming children and essentially using gag orders to shut the kid up and their family and prevent them from seeking justice. There's a long-standing debate among former Jehovah's Witnesses about this word cult, whether or not to call the Jehovah's Witnesses a cult. And I do understand the logic. They don't want to, scare someone off, scare a Jehovah's Witness off who might be questioning, and then they hear the word cult and then, oh my God, they just feel attacked and sort of shut down. I do understand that. That's a valid concern. I know some other former witnesses prefer to call the organization a high control group, and again, that's not technically wrong. They are a high control group. But I, for one, am a staunch proponent of referring to the Jehovah's Witnesses as a cult, calling it like it is. I've been doing this for a while. I've been out for 8 years, and of course there's people who have been out 30, 40 years who've been out way longer than I have, and they've been calling it a cult, which is good. But I've been doing this for a while. Every time, it comes up in conversation. Maybe I'm at a coffee shop, or somehow I'm meeting somebody, it's an acquaintance, just somebody out and about. It comes up in conversation. Yeah, I'm a writer. Oh, you're a writer. Oh, you were in a cult? Oh my gosh, what was the cult? And I'm like, yeah, I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses. 9 times out of 10. Okay, 9 times out of 10. I get an automatic reflex of, oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, I thought you meant a real cult. I personally feel the more we don't use the word cult to describe the Jehovah's Witnesses, it diminishes the urgency and gravity of their harm. Because people know what cult means. It evokes, like I said, oh, you were in a cult? It evokes a very visceral response. There's images that are immediately conjured up. Oh, was there some sort of strange guru? Oh, what kind of mystical, spiritual craziness was this? I went through 5 therapists when I left the organization back in 2017. Just briefly, just to see who I would fit with. But every single not a therapist knew the horrors of the organization. Not one. When Jehovah's Witnesses are not included in the conversation of being a cult, the more this is going to happen. The more people are going to laugh. Like, you want the witnesses to answer for their abuses, right? Answer for their crimes. But you want to couch your language. All right. Is it any wonder no one takes them seriously? I'm sorry, I thought you meant a real cult. We're the survivors. We know better. I, for one, am glad this man had the balls to call them a cult. So, yeah, really excited to see where this goes. This is big. I mean, I wish more politicians were doing this in the US, but that really will be the day that pigs fly. I hope that I'm wrong about that. It'll be really interesting to see where this goes. I'm just glad that there's exposure out there that Jehovah's Witnesses are in fact a cult, and bringing light to the CSA cases and how Sam Carling, I think, put it. He says there needs to be watertight restrictions or stipulations. There needs to be, we have a good bill, but it needs to be better. It needs to be stronger because kids are still being hurt. Victims are still being silenced. So kudos and bravo to Sam Carling and this Cameron Thomas. Big day. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you next time.